If you want to stop giving away your power and learn how dominance is really seized and surrendered in relationships, subscribe to Dark Horizons, hit the bell, and comment "I hold frame." This isn't about being loud, it's about owning the system quietly and permanently. You weren't born powerless. You came in with confidence, direction, the kind of presence that made her lean in, follow your lead, reward your decisions. That's the attraction. But somewhere slowly, almost imperceptibly, that dynamic flips. Now she's choosing where you go, what you spend, what's acceptable, and you're asking permission like you swallowed the script of your own authority. That transfer didn't happen in a headline moment. It was built one, "It's fine, whatever you want, and I'll just do it myself," at a time. Welcome to Frame Theft, a dark psychological process where your leadership erodes and someone else quietly picks up the reins. Here's the core truth most men never hear. Every relationship is a power environment. It does not default to equality. It defaults to whoever controls the narrative, the boundaries, and the emotional currents. That control is called frame. Frame isn't just swagger or being vocal. It's the structural authority to define what's normal, what's expected, what's negotiable, what's off limits. If you don't hold it, someone else will, usually through emotional leverage disguised as care. You think giving in to avoid conflict is love. That's the first concession. That's the first micro-surrender. She doesn't have to take your power with a fight. She collects it. You shape your choices around her moods, apologize for things that weren't wrong, and slowly start valuing her approval over your own judgment. Each time you validate her emotional narrative at the cost of your principle, you teach her that your frame is malleable. That's the lesson. And once she believes your boundaries are flexible, she starts testing them: soft pressure, small suggestions, emotional weight that bends you. You accommodate one request. Next week it becomes a rule. You blink. She's the one setting the terms. Attraction collapses because she stops seeing leadership. She sees compliance. This isn't manipulation from the outside. It's internal surrender dressed up as maturity and love. You're told compromise is noble. You're not told that compromise without core standards is capitulation. Women don't seek weak men intentionally. Biology and psychology don't crave submission for fun, they test for strength. The moment you make her feelings the ultimate arbitrator of your decisions, you become someone she can control without overt force. You lose respect in her eyes, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped leading. And here is the irony. The more you try to make her happy by giving her what she wants, the less attraction she has for you. Compliance over time becomes contempt disguised as indifference. The genius and danger of this dynamic is subtlety. There's no dramatic takeover. It happens in thousands of tiny surrenders. Missing one night out becomes "you don't prioritize us." Paying for something she wants becomes "you're stingy with your support." Saying no once becomes a pattern of "you're selfish." These are not isolated mistakes. They're evidence deposits building a precedent. Your frame is negotiable. Frame battles aren't won in fury, they're won in consistent refusal to give ground when tested. And most men don't even recognize the tests, because they relabeled emotional maturity, keeping peace, or love. She has a testing system built into how she interacts, a layered unconscious pressure method. It's not malicious, necessarily. It's biological programming assessing whether you're a stable anchor or a shifting current. Every ask, every emotional escalation is a probe. Will you bend? Will you cave? Will you adjust? If you yield, you've demonstrated malleability. If you hold calmly, uncompromisingly, you've demonstrated strength. The woman doesn't want a man who never causes discomfort. She wants one whose discomfort proves authenticity, not weakness. That's why the man who stays steady in the storm becomes more attractive. The one who trembles for harmony becomes less reliable in her eyes. So what do most men do? They listen to the internal voice that screams avoid conflict, thinking that's love. They interpret resistance as rejection and bend to remove the friction. They don't see the pattern because the surrender feels reasonable in isolation. Just this once, I'll do it to keep things calm. I'll apologize even though I wasn't wrong. That's how desertion of your own core happens. Incrementally, with good intentions attached like weights. The dark motivational shift you need. Start seeing those small concessions as frame losses, not peacekeeping wins. Each time she pressures you emotionally and you respond by changing your plan or perspective out of fear of upsetting her, you reinforce the idea that your frame is thin. For every single test she gives, respond with the same silent, unapologetic strength. A calm "no, that doesn't work for me." A consistent priority. A boundary that doesn't bend just because pressure is applied. Weakness isn't what she resents, it's inconsistency. When you hold again and again, the tests stop. That's how wars of dominance end. Not with a final blow, but with the slow realization that the frame no longer moves. She stops testing because the outcome is predictable. You don't cave, you become the anchor. The difference between men who lose their relationship power and those who gain lasting influence charisma. It's a refusal to trade principle for temporary harmony. The person who can walk away, even internally, holds all the leverage. Women sense that. They feel the optional nature of their presence when you don't panic to please. That's when real respect is built, not through compliance, but through authenticity grounded in how she escalates control when your frame makes her uncomfortable. It's not random. It's a three-stage psychological cascade that convinces you to surrender in a way that feels like you chose it. I call it the pity-shame withdrawal system. And if you've been in the slow fade of authority in your relationship, you've been climbing that ladder. Stage 1, pity. She paints herself as the wounded party. Maybe you didn't text back right away. Maybe you didn't notice something she told you in passing. She doesn't accuse you, she signals hurt with soft language. I just thought we'd spend time together, but I guess you're too busy. That line isn't about time, it's a lever. It pulls your protective instinct. You feel like you're failing her. You're not told what to do explicitly, but you respond anyway, adjusting your schedule, over-explaining, offering reassurance. That first concession feels like care. You're drawing the narrative that you're responsible for her emotional equilibrium. Here's the catch. The moment you fix it by sacrificing your time or priorities, you've taught her that your frame bends when she expresses pain without ever having to use force. Pity is the soft opening. It's the emotional version of a test balloon. If you shift, she moves to the next stage with more expectation. Stage 2, shame. When pity hasn't fully bent you, she ramps into identity-level pressure. Your choices aren't just inconvenient, they're evidence. Real men would understand. Other guys wouldn't make her feel this way. Maybe you're just not ready to grow. This is not critique. It's a calibrated attack on your identity. It doesn't tell you that you're wrong. It implies you are failing to be enough. That attack triggers internal chaos. You start questioning your value, your judgment, your masculinity. Why? Because shame is not rational, it's existential. When you respond by changing decisions, apologizing, or altering your behavior to prove you're not the deficient man she is describing, you surrender more than a choice. You surrender self-definition. You've started to redefine your actions based on avoiding the pain of being labeled weak, rather than leading from what you believe. Stage 3. Withdraw, cold, silent, calibrated. If pity and shame don't fully extract the surrender, she pulls back. Absence of warmth, quiet distance, subtle withholding, not loud arguments, but a quiet recalibration of emotional temperature. The message is simple. The relationship is less safe when you're not aligning. You feel it. The silence is heavy. You chase resolution. You initiate the contact. You explain that chase. That need to bridge the gap becomes the final collapse of your frame. Withdrawal weaponizes discomfort. Your response rebuilds the bridge using your own authority as currency. You end up apologizing for your presence, liberal with access, closeness, explanation, reinforcing her control because you are the one doing the work to repair a temperature she controls. Here's the devastating pattern most men never see. Each of the 3 stages, taken alone, feels like a reasonable emotional interaction. She's hurt. You respond. She questions your motives. You adjust. She withdraws. You pursue. But stringed together, they become a pipeline of dominance. You move from leader to supplicant without ever recognizing you crossed the line because every step was framed as love, care, responsibility, fixing something broken. The system doesn't need to use force. The illusion of your choice is the trap. The dark motivational shift. You must refuse the emotional ladder. The first time she uses pity, hold frame without overcompensating. The first shame attempt, internalize the identity attack and separate your values from her narrative. Respond with clarity, not capitulation. When withdrawal hits, don't chase to repair your worth. Maintain presence on your terms. You don't have to fight silence with noise. Silence becomes a test of whether your frame is anchored. The moment you feel the pull to bend for peace instead of principle, you've already surrendered the next layer. Weaponizing this understanding, name the escalation. The moment she shifts from hurt to identity assault to absence, call it out quietly. I see you're pulling back. I'm not changing who I am to chase approval. Flip the script. Use her test as confirmation she's assessing strength. I get it, you're checking if my boundaries are real. Hold. Reclaim the narrative, instead of reacting to her emotional states. Reframe the dialogue. I'm not here to avoid your discomfort. I'm here to lead with clarity. Let's decide what's next together. The man who understands this system doesn't get trapped. He becomes the benchmark. The three-stage pull that once tightened into surrender now reveals itself as a quality assessment. He doesn't resent it. He welcomes it. He doesn't give in. He passes not through appeasement, but through consistent, quiet authority. By now you've seen the frame theft and the psychological ladder. You think the battle is over once you stop giving ground. That's where most men get complacent. She doesn't need to keep asking if you've already surrendered. The real control comes from emotional accounting. The invisible ledger she keeps on what you've invested, what she's given, and what she can call due again. This is how dominance becomes self-reinforcing without force. You start paying off debts she never declared, and you begin to value her generosity as leverage over your autonomy. Here's how it works. She gives you something: attention, warmth, approval. Sex then marks it in the internal books. You feel good because human brains are wired to reciprocate. That's the bait. The moment her mood shifts, she pulls the emotional receipt out like a bill. After everything I did for you, you can't do this. That's not gratitude. That's a subtly weaponized expectation. The deeper you sink into giving to make things right, the heavier the weight of that account becomes. Suddenly you're paying interest on a debt you didn't know you owed. Dark psychology, truth. Control isn't always about taking, it's about managing perceived debt and reciprocity. She's not keeping track because she's malicious. Sometimes she is. More often it's subconscious. She knows that when you feel indebted, you become pliable, so she calibrates her contributions, offering comfort at the exact moment you're weak, then scaling back to create a withdrawal you earn back. She knows the patterns of your gratitude, your guilt, your need to make up for things. She's not just climbing the ladder of surrender anymore. She's installing you as the supplier of her power while she gets to define the exchange rate. Let's break down the system. The emotional deposit. She gives small kindnesses or attention when she wants influence to rise. Maybe she's extra warm after you concede on something and acts like she's sacrificed to keep peace. That warmth becomes a deposit in your mind. I did the right thing. She's appreciative. I'm valuable. You unconsciously seek to keep that balance by giving more. The conditional reward. Nothing she gives comes unconditional. Attention is contingent on compliance, affection on validation, sex on emotional submission. She's not overtly saying, earn it. She's layering conditions in behavior. You notice the change in energy when you diverge, and you self-correct to recover the reward. A man who doesn't recognize the contingency gets trapped into perpetually chasing approval. The silent ledger. She doesn't have to recite the debts, she lets your own mind do it for her. You internalize, I need to make it up. I owe her. If I don't perform, I'll lose her. That internalized accounting becomes your prison. She only needs to allude to imbalanced slight disappointment, a pause in conversation, and the guilt you feel does the enforcing. Dominance becomes invisible because you're policing yourself on her behalf. The reverse leverage flip. When you try to withdraw a whole frame, set boundaries, she reframes your independence as selfishness, coldness, or lack of care. That's emotional debt collection in reverse. She charges you for not meeting her invisible expectations, pulling your sovereignty back under the pretense of relationship maintenance. This system is reinforced by small rituals. Gratitude checks. After all, I've done recaps. Selective vulnerability that demands reciprocity. You give, she forgives you with warmth. Then the next test shows up and the cycle repeats. Over time, the emotional interest compounds. Your self-esteem becomes tied to clearing the ledger-chasing piece by paying emotional dues you never needed to. Manipulative insight turned weapon for you. Flip the ledger, become the one who defines the exchange. Don't give for her comfort without clear mutual value. When she offers warmth, don't internalize it as a deposit you must immediately repay. Instead, ask internally, what's the intent? Am I aligning with my frame or volunteering to be sanded down? Strategies. Transparency audit. Quietly notice when you feel indebted. Track what behaviors triggered that feeling. Ask, was that my choice or conditioned compliance? Rebalance intentionally. When she withholds emotional currency to test you, don't chase the withdrawal. Instead, maintain your baseline. Let her adjust to your consistency. She either escalate the test or adapt. Either outcome gives you clarity. Set the terms. If you choose to invest emotionally, do it with intention and mutuality, not automatic reciprocity. Make sure she knows without drama what actions are meaningful and what boundaries exist. The moment you stop being a passive depositor, the emotional accounting shifts. The ledger loses leverage because the currency is no longer freely surrendered. This is how women establish ongoing dominance without taking. They engineer dependency through emotional economics, and the supremacist move for you is to neutralize the ledger by refusing to owe silent debt, turn the account transparent, make your emotional investments scarce, and reclaim the balance of power. Now you know the infrastructure: frame theft, emotional ladder, and accounting. The next phase in the dominance playbook is how she deals with your resistance, how she neutralizes your pushback, so control persists even when you try to push against it. This is where subtle manipulation gets cruelly efficient. When you hold frame, she doesn't stop. She escalates into systems built to fracture your certainty, destabilize your resistance, and pull you back into submission without overt collapse. That's the arsenal: gaslighting, love bombing, and withholding. Each one cracks at a different part of your internal armor. Gaslighting: this isn't just making you doubt your memory. It's a slow erosion of your internal truth calibration. You call something out: you said you'd be here, and she says, no, I didn't. You're remembering it wrong. You begin second-guessing your perception. That subtle doubt grows teeth. You start looking for verification before you act. Your skepticism of her manipulation turns inward. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I am too sensitive. She doesn't need to be dramatic. She uses tiny redefinitions of reality to shift your baseline. Over time, your internal compass shifts toward her version of truth. Her dominance is cemented because your own mind becomes her ally in controlling your behavior. Love: when resistance surfaces, when you push back, when you reclaim a boundary, she floods you with intense warmth, validation, affection. Not because she's suddenly changed, because she's neutralizing your threat. That flood rewires your neural response. You associate your resistance with withdrawal, then immediate reward. It creates a mental loop. When I push, I lose the good. When I comply, I get it back. You start correcting preemptively. Your sovereignty becomes tied to emotional reward scheduling. Love bombing doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like relief, which is exactly why it's effective. It disarms the resistance you built by making the cost of holding frame emotionally expensive. Withholding: most damaging of all because it weaponizes absence. Once you've shown strength, she uses silence, affection removal, intimacy evaporation, or information blackouts as punishment for non-compliance. It's not always dramatic. It's a subtle drop in availability, a delay in reply, a cooler tone, a missed "I love you." You feel the shift. Your brain, wired for connection, wants to fix the distance. You begin offering explanations, overcompensating, trying to earn the warmth back. That's the neutralization. She didn't need to take, she simply paused her contribution and watched you devalue your frame to get it restarted. These three tools used in rotation are devastating because they attack different cognitive systems. Gaslighting fractures your internal reality. Love bombing rewires your reward circuitry. Withholding turns your need for connection into leverage against your own independence. You think the solution is just not reacting. That's naive. Real resistance requires contextual reanchoring. You need a mental failsafe that says, this cycle is manipulation. My perception is not invalidated. My boundaries are not emotional currency to be bought back with affection. Without that anchor, your resistance becomes a yo-yo pushed outward, pulled back in, exhausted into surrender. Here's how you neutralize the neutralizer. Reality, anchor. Keep a private log. When she contradicts reality, write down what happened immediately. Date, details. Your memory is your base evidence. When she gaslights, you don't argue emotionally, you reference your anchor with calm/controlled language, then disengage. You don't concede your internal map. Reward recalibration. When love bombed after resistance, don't absorb the flood as validation for submission. Call it what it is internally. A reset attempt. You can accept affection without altering your boundary. You distinguish appreciation from capitulation. That's the difference between being softened and being softened into compliance. Withholding immunity. Create your own emotional reservoir. If she withdraws warmth, you don't scramble to refill the gap. You maintain presence, clarity, and self-derived fulfillment. You can ask for recalibration. I notice distance. I'm not going to chase it, but if you want connection, let's have a direct conversation. That phrasing removes the emotional bait. It puts her back on equal ground for choice, not you on deficit. The psychological twist. The moment she senses you've decoded these patterns, her dominance slips, not because she loses power, but because her tools blunt against a frame that doesn't flex. She either escalates, exposing the manipulation, or she recalibrates, respecting your boundaries. That's when real power shifts back to you, not through confrontation, but by operating outside the systems she deploys, uninfected and unmoved. You've seen how frame is stolen, how emotional ladders pull you down, how ledgers of debt keep you compliant, and how resistance is neutralized. Now you take it back. This section is the pivot. You stop reacting and start reclaiming frame deliberately, forcing reciprocity instead of paying it with surrender. Dominance doesn't mean you bully. It means you define the environment so clearly that others adapt to your rules without needing to beg, plead, or explain yourself away. When you reclaim frame properly, she stops attempting covert theft because the tests no longer yield leverage. Instead, she's confronted with a man who doesn't negotiate from scarcity, who doesn't collapse under emotional accounting, and who refuses to trade core standards for temporary peace. Look, most men think the dynamic flips when they stand up. That's naive. The flip happens when you reframe the currency and make her pay in authenticity for the emotional access she's been taking for free. Step 1. Frame reset ritual. You do this alone, in silence. Identify the 3 areas where her influence creeps in under the guise of we. Money decisions, calendar priorities, emotional arbitration. For each, ask, what have I conceded as a default, and why did I accept it? Then, silently to yourself, declare the new boundary. Our finances are discussed. My time is non-negotiable outside of mutual planning. Emotional escalation doesn't override principle. No drama, no announcement, just recalibration internally. The frame resets not by argument, but by internal sovereignty. From that point, every time those domains are touched, you operate from the new baseline. She feels it. She tests less because she senses the immovability. Step 2. Reciprocity engine. You stop giving unconditional emotional labor. Instead, you build a system. For every emotional investment you make, there's intentional input from her side before the next. That doesn't mean tit for tat in petty ways. It means you no longer function as the default caretaker of mood, energy, or validation. If you listen to her vulnerability, it's with a calibrated ask. I heard you. I'll hold that space. Before we go deeper, I need to know how you're reflecting on mine. That sentence flips the ledger. Suddenly her comfort is not a given. It's a relationship currency she has to match. You've taken the emotional accounting and made it mutual. She can weaponize, after all I did, because the narrative now includes, after all I invested, where's your contribution? The frame shifts because you are the reference point for balance, not her emotional fluctuations. Step 3. Silent boundary enforcement. When she attempts the pity-shame withdrawal cascade, you don't escalate, you don't justify, you enforce silently. She drops a soft hurt cue. You acknowledge the emotion, once I hear you're upset, and then keep your plan. She ups to shame. It's like you don't care. You don't defend your heart. You restate the principle. I care. I won't give up the standard we agreed on. She withdraws. You hold present, consistent, no chase. That absence of reaction is the new enforcement. Without your emotional correction, the model collapses. She either adapts to a system that no longer bends, or she reveals the manipulation as manipulation and you get clarity. Win-win. That's the power of silent enforcement. You don't argue the submission, you refuse to supply it. Step 4. Weight of optionality. One of the most brutal frame restorations is the demonstration of optionality. When you stop leaning into emotional rescue, she feels the margin. You don't announce you're optional, you act like it. Consistent, self-sourced fulfillment. Minimal begging for approval, and the quiet availability that says, I am here, but I'm not held hostage. This creates internal tension in her test system. She either increases attempts to reclaim that elasticity, or she respects the new perimeter. Either way, the dominance shifts because the dynamic no longer has you chasing peace. You're choosing partnership. That's the subtle dominance. You give, but you don't bleed. You stay high-valued without performing. That is what makes her recalibrate her own behavior to match your baseline, rather than you continuing to adapt to her emotional tides. Step 5. Reclaiming your narrative. Every story she's tried to spin, you're selfish for asking. You don't prioritize me enough. You're too insensitive. You rebrand internally before you ever debate it externally. You hold the narrative on your terms. You don't let her shame flip the internal language. When the identity attacks arrive, you respond with internal anchors. My refusal isn't selfish. It's self-authorship. You keep a private ledger of your values, not of her emotional debts. And when you speak, your language reflects that internal alignment. You're not explaining because you've already decided. She either adjusts to your certainty or reveals that she wants compliance, not partnership. You choose accordingly. Step 6. Tactical rebalancing. When her frame theft attempts start accumulating again, you deploy targeted rebalancing, a brief conversation that isn't reactive. I noticed we VA drifted into old patterns where I take on emotional labor without equal input. That changes. Then you pull back slightly on the behaviors that were too easy to supply, not as punishment, but as recalibration. Her default expectation of your accommodation gets reset because the supply tightens. That's the lever. Dominance isn't shouting. It's the slow, deliberate quantity control of your time, energy, and clarity. Dark twist. Real dominance in this domain is never used to crush her. It's used to structure the relationship so you don't lose yourself while still being engaged. The men who reclaim frame and maintain reciprocity create an environment where loyalty is earned, respect is mutual, and surrender, if it ever happens, is a choice, not a theft. This is where the rebuild becomes empire. You've reclaimed frame. You've forced reciprocity. You aren't bending to emotional debt. Now you scale your presence into sovereign leadership, not just in this relationship, but in the psychological ecosystem around you. The difference between a temporary win and lasting dominance is that the temporary man fights his way back to equilibrium and then falls again when pressure returns. Sovereign leadership is a self-sustaining gravitational field. Everyone around you adapts to your calibrated authority because it's predictable, strong, and consistent. You don't need to dominate through conflict. You lead by design, and others follow because their internal models calibrate to your clarity, not because they fear you, but because they trust the order you hold. Hook. Leadership that lasts isn't taken in battles. It's maintained in peace through standards that don't bend, rituals that reinforce identity, and presence that doesn't shrink under pressure. The code of sovereign influence. Write it down. I lead by being the calm center. I do not justify my boundaries. I explain them once. I offer value before asking for alignment. I hold accountability privately and publicly. I build reciprocity by making others responsible for their emotional share. This code becomes the internal constitution of your sovereignty. You memorize it. You live it. You revisit it whenever the old economic emotional loops try to reassert themselves. It's not a list of rigid rules. It's your adaptive architecture. Rituals that reinforce you don't disappear into power. You ritualize it. Weekly alignment check. One short conversation where both sides speak what's working and what's drifting. Held from a place of calm, demand not need. Monthly frame audit. Assess where you've bent, why, and whether that bend was strategic or reflexive. Adjust quietly. Daily sovereign pause. Before any decision that risks giving ground. Take a breath. Run the internal filter. Is this aligned with the code? Then act. That pause is the crown. The world rushes. You choose. Influence without capitulation. The illusion of leadership is loudness. Real influence is presence that doesn't bow to manipulation. When anchored, her attempt to drag you into old cycles fails because she cannot predict your reaction. Her emotional escalation becomes background noise. You no longer feel compelled to fix things that aren't broken. You calibrate when adjustment matters, and disengage when tests are disguised as crises. That makes your decisions feel like gravity, inevitable, natural, and stabilizing. Others women included stop looking to move you. They start aligning because the friction of resistance has been replaced by the clarity of shared standards. Legacy of frame. This isn't just about this woman. This is about how you operate in every power environment. You become the man who other men benchmark against, not to mimic, but to respect. You build a small inner circle of aligned sovereignty, teaching them the same architecture. Frame, reclamation, reciprocity, calibration, silent enforcement, sovereign pause. Their loyalty is earned because you model what consistent dominance without desperation looks like. Your influence compounds, not by coercion, but by structural reliability. Final rule. Never surrender the crown twice. The crown isn't lost in a dramatic moment. It's chipped away by tiny concessions. One justice once. One emotional debt paid, unsacrificed. One unexamined retreat. The moment you surrender frame, you don't rebuild the same way. You rebuild stronger if you recognize the theft early and correct. That means the sovereign leader has a built-in recovery protocol. Admit the drift, audit the fracture, reset the ledger, enforce silently, and move forward. You don't flirt with regression. You adapt around it. If you're done surrendering your power in silence, like this video, subscribe to Dark Horizons, and comment "I hold frame" below. Share the one subtle concession you reclaiming today, and start building a legacy of sovereign influence that never collapses under emotional theft.